The cruelty of the Caesar Gallus. When this arduous campaign reached its end, both sides were exhausted. Their morale had been sapped by its manifold dangers and difficulties, but before the trumpets had ceased to bray, or the troops had taken up their winter quarters, cruel fortune let loose upon the state the squalls of another storm, which arose from the many fearful misdeeds of the Caesar Gallus. Gallus in his early manhood had risen at a bound, from what seemed like a hopeless depth of misery to the height of power, and going beyond the limits of the authority granted to him, was causing universal mischief by his excessive harshness. His pride was inflated by his kinship with the imperial house, and by the fact that he shared the name of Constantius, and it appeared that only a lack of strength kept him from embarking on hostilities against the author of his prosperity. His savage nature found a sharp spur in his wife, who had been previously married by her father Constantine to his nephew, King Hannibalian. As sister of the emperor, her pride was swollen beyond measure. She was a fury in mortal form, incessantly adding fuel to her husband's rage, and as thirsty for human blood as he. Time made the pair more expert in inflicting harm. Adroit secret dealers in backstairs gossip, versed in the evil trade of exaggerating slight rumours, brought them the false reports they had wished to hear, and innocent people were charged with aspiring to the throne, or practising black arts. Notorious above lesser cases, once their tyranny no longer stopped short at minor crimes, was the sudden and wicked death of Climatius, a prominent native of Alexandria. The story went that his mother-in-law, who lusted after him, but found herself unable to seduce him, gained entrance to the palace through a back door, and by the present of a valuable necklace to the queen, procured the dispatch of a death warrant to Honoratus, at that time Count of the East, by which means Climatius, an utterly innocent man, was put to death without being allowed to open his mouth or speak. After this act of wickedness, which, now that cruelty had been given free rein, aroused fears that it would be repeated in other cases, a number of people were found guilty and condemned through mere misty suspicion. Of these, some were put to death, others suffered confiscation of their property and were driven into exile from their homes. Left with no resource but complaints and tears, they supported their lives on the charity of others, but when what had been a just constitutional government was transformed into a bloody despotism, many rich and noble houses shut their doors to them. In the past, savage emperors had often preserved the appearance of legality by preferring charges against their victims in the courts of law, but now even a counterfeit accusation was felt to be superfluous, as one mischief was heaped upon another. Whatever the implacable Caesar had resolved was immediately put into effect, as if it had all the force of a deliberate legal decision. A further device was to station in all quarters of Antioch a number of unknown persons whose very insignificance shielded them from suspicion, and whose task it was to report what they heard. These people, mingling clandestinely and as it were en passant with parties of men of standing, and infiltrating into wealthy houses in the guise of people in want, took back whatever information they could pick up to the palace, to which they were secretly admitted by a back door. They were careful to observe a common policy, which was to invent a part of their report, to make the worst of any known facts by exaggeration, and to suppress any remarks favourable to the Caesar, which in many cases were extorted from unwilling speakers by fear of trouble to come. It sometimes happened that what the father of a family had whispered to his wife in the furthest corners of his bedroom, with no confidential servants present, became known on the following day to the prince, as if it had been revealed by Amphiarus or Marcius, the famous seers of old. In consequence, men began to fear even the walls, which were the only witnesses of their secrets. The obstinacy of Gallus in investigating matters of this kind was increased by the influence of the Queen, who was pushing her husband headlong into destruction. It should have been her part to bring him by feminine mildness and sensible advice back to the paths of truth and kindness, like the wife of the fierce Emperor Maximin, whose story I have already told in my account of the Gordians. Finally, Gallus had the audacity to embark on a new and disastrous course, which gave rise to grave scandal. It is said that Gallienus disgraced himself utterly by sometimes pursuing it at Rome. Taking with him a few attendants armed with hidden weapons, Gallus used to roam in the evenings about the streets and eating houses, asking everybody in Greek, of which he had a thorough knowledge, what their thoughts of the Caesar were. He was bold enough to do this in a city where the brightness of the street lighting made night as clear as day. At last, when he had been frequently recognised, he realised that he would make himself conspicuous if he went out, and after this, he was seen in public only in the daytime, and for reasons which he considered of sufficient importance. All of this grieved many people to the heart. Certainly, Fallacius, at that time the praetorian prefect at court, a man of overbearing nature himself, who saw many people being put in danger by Gallus's increasingly hasty temper, did nothing to assuage the Caesar's anger by experienced advice, as high officials have sometimes done in other cases. Instead, he roused him to madness by opposition and unseasonable reproaches. At the same time, he sent frequent exaggerated reports of his behaviour to the emperor, and for some reason which is not clear, made no secret of the fact that he was doing so. By this means, the Caesar's savage temper was further exacerbated. He raised on high, so to speak, the banner of self-will, and was carried away, without regard for the safety either of himself or others, by an irreversible momentum, like that of a rushing river, to overturn the obstacles which lay in his path. Inroads of the Isaurians. And indeed, this was not the only calamity to afflict the Orient with various disasters, for the Isaurians too, whose way it is now to keep the peace, and now to put everything in turmoil by sudden raids, abandoned their occasional secret plundering expeditions, and as impunity stimulated for the worse their growing boldness, broke out in a serious war. For a long time they had been inflaming their warlike spirits by reckless outbreaks, but they were now especially exasperated, as they declared, by the indignity of some of their associates, who had been taken prisoner, having been thrown to the beasts of prey in the shows of the amphitheatre at Iconium, a town in Pisidia, an outrage without precedent, and in the words of Cicero, as even wild animals, when warned by hunger, generally return to the place where they were once fed, so they all, swooping like a whirlwind down from their steep and rugged mountains, made for the districts near the sea, and hiding themselves there in pathless lurking places and defiles, as the dark nights were coming on, the moon being still crescent, and so not shining with full brilliance, they watched the sailors, and when they saw that they were buried in sleep, creeping on all fours along the anchor ropes and making their way on tiptoe into the boats, they came upon the crews all unawares, and since their natural ferocity was fired by greed, they spared no one, even of those who surrendered, but massacred them all, and without resistance carried off the cargoes, led either by their value or by their usefulness. This, however, did not continue long, for when the fate of those whom they had butchered and plundered became known, no one afterwards put in at those ports, but avoiding them as they would the deadly cliffs of Sciron, they coasted along the shores of Cyprus, which lay opposite to the crags of Isuria. Then presently, as time went on and nothing came their way from abroad, they left the sea-coast and withdrew to that part of Lycaonia that borders on Isauria, and there, blocking the roads with close barricades, they lived on the property of the provincials and of travellers. Anger at this aroused the soldiers quartered in the numerous towns and fortresses which lie near those regions, and each division strove to the best of its power to check the marauders as they ranged more widely, now in solid bodies, sometimes even in isolated bands, but the soldiers were defeated by the strength and numbers of the Isaurians, for since the Isaurians were born and brought up amid the steep and winding defiles of the mountains, they bounded over them as if they were a smooth and level plain, attacking the enemy with savage howls, and sometimes our infantry in pursuing them were forced to scale lofty slopes, and when they lost their footing, even if they reached the very summits by catching hold of underbrush or briars, the narrow and pathless tracts allowed them neither to take order of battle, nor with mighty effort to keep a firm footing, and while the enemy running here and there tore off and hurried down masses of rocks from above, they made their perilous way down over steep slopes, or, if compelled by dire necessity, they made a brave fight. They were overwhelmed by falling boulders of enormous weight in these fights. Therefore, extreme caution was shown after that, and when the marauders began to make for the mountain heights, the soldiers yielded to an unfavourable position. When, however, the Isaurians could be found on level ground, as constantly happened, they were allowed neither to stretch out their right arms nor poise their weapons, of which each carried 2 or 3, but they were slaughtered like defenceless sheep. Accordingly, these same marauders, distrusting Lycaonia, which is for the most part level, and having learned by repeated experience that they would be no match for our soldiers in a stand-up fight, made their way by retired bypaths into Pamphylia, long unmolested, it is true, but through fear of raids and massacres protected everywhere by strong garrisons, while troops were spread all over the neighbouring country. Therefore they made great haste, in order by extreme swiftness to anticipate the reports of their movements, trusting in their bodily strength and activity. But they made their way somewhat slowly to the summits of the hills, over winding trails, and when, after overcoming extreme difficulties, they came to the steep banks of the Meles, a deep and eddying stream, which surrounds the inhabitants like a wall and protects them, the lateness of the night increased their alarm, and they halted for a time, waiting for daylight. They thought indeed to cross without opposition, and by the unexpected raid to lay waste all before them. But they endured the greatest hardships for no purpose, for when the sun rose, they were prevented from crossing by the size of the stream, which was narrow but deep, and while they were hunting for fishermen's boats, or preparing to cross on hastily woven hurdles, the legions that were then wintering at side poured out and fell upon them in swift attack, and having set up their standards near the river-bank, the legions drew themselves up most skilfully for fighting hand-to-hand with a close formation of shields, and with perfect ease they slew some, who had even dared to cross the river secretly, trusting to swimming or in hollowed-out tree trunks. From there, after trying the skill of our soldiers, even to a final test without gaining anything, dislodged by fear and the strength of the legions, and not knowing what direction to take, they came to the neighbourhood of the town of Laranda. There they were refreshed with food and rest, and after their fear had left them, they attacked some rich villages, but since they were aided by some cohorts of cavalry which chanced to come up, the enemy withdrew without attempting any resistance on the level plain, but as they retreated, they summoned all the flower of their youth that had been left at home, and since they were distressed by severe hunger, they made for a place called Palaia, near the sea, which was protected by a strong wall. Their supplies are regularly stored even today for distribution to the troops that defend the whole frontier of Isauria. Therefore, they invested the fortress for 3 days and 3 nights, but since the steep slope itself could not be approached without deadly peril, and nothing could be effected by mines, and no method of siege was successful, they withdrew in dejection, ready under the pressure of extreme necessity to undertake even tasks beyond their powers. Accordingly, filled with still greater fury, to which despair and famine added fuel, with increased numbers and irresistible energy, they rushed on to destroy Seleucia, the metropolis of the province, which Count Castricius was holding with 3 legions, steeled by hard service. Warned of their approach by trusty scouts, the officers of the garrison gave the watchword according to regulations, and in a swift sally led out the entire force, and having quickly crossed the bridge over the river Calcadnus, whose mighty stream washes the towers of the city walls, they drew up their men in order of battle, and yet no one charged or was allowed to fight, for they feared that band on fire with madness, superior in numbers and ready to rush upon the sword regardless of their lives. Consequently, when the army came into view afar off, and the notes of the trumpets were heard, the marauders stopped and halted for a while, and, drawing their formidable swords, they came on at a slower pace. And when the unperturbed soldiers made ready to meet them, deploying their ranks and striking their shields with their spears, an action which rouses the wrath and resentment of the combatants, they intimidated the nearest of the enemy by their very gestures, but as they were eagerly rushing to the fray, their leaders called them back, thinking it inadvisable to risk a double combat when fortifications were not far distant, under the protection of which the safety of all could be put on a solid foundation. In this conviction, then, the warriors were led back within the walls. The entrances to the gates on all sides were barred, and they took their places on the battlements and pinnacles, with rocks gathered from every hand and weapon in readiness, so that if anyone should force his way near to the walls, he might be overwhelmed by a shower of spears and stones. Still, the besieged were greatly troubled by the fact that the Isaurians, having captured some boats which were carrying grain on the river, were abundantly supplied with provisions, while they themselves had already exhausted the regular stores and were dreading the deadly pangs of approaching famine. When the news of this situation spread abroad, the repeated messages dispatched to Gallus Caesar had roused him to action, since the master of the horse was at that time too far removed from the spot. Orders were given to Nebridius, Count of the East. He quickly got together troops from every side, and with the greatest energy was hastening to rescue this great and strategically important city from danger. On learning this, the freebooters departed without accomplishing anything more of consequence, and scattering, after their usual fashion, made for the trackless wastes of the high mountains. An unsuccessful plot of the Persians. When affairs had reached this stage in Isauria, the king of Persia, involved in war with his neighbours, was driving back from his frontiers a number of very wild tribes which, with inconsistent policy, often made hostile raids upon his territories, and sometimes aid him when he makes war upon us. One of his grandees, Nohodares by name, having received orders to invade Mesopotamia whenever occasion offered, was carefully reconnoitring our territory, intending a sudden incursion in case he found any opening. And as all the districts of Mesopotamia, being exposed to frequent raids, were protected by frontier guards and country garrison, Nohodares, having turned his course to the left, had beset the remotest parts of Osdrone, attempting a novel and all but unprecedented manoeuvre, and if he had succeeded, he would have devastated the whole region like a thunderbolt. Now what he planned was the following. The town of Batnae, founded in Amphimusia in early times by a band of Macedonians, is separated by a short space from the river Euphrates. It is filled with wealthy traders when at the yearly festival, near the beginning of the month of September. A great crowd of every condition gathers for the fair, to traffic in the wares sent from India and China, and in other articles that are regularly brought there in great abundance by land and sea. This district the above-mentioned leader made ready to invade on the day set for this celebration, through the wilderness and the grass-covered banks of the river Abora, but he was betrayed by information given by some of his own soldiers who, fearing punishment for a crime which they had committed, deserted to the Roman garrison. Therefore, withdrawing without accomplishing anything, he languished there in inaction. The customs of the Saracens. The Saracens, however, whom we have never found desirable either as friends or as enemies, ranging up and down the country in a brief space of time laid waste whatever they could find, like rapacious birds, which, whenever they have caught sight of any prey from on high, seize it with a swift swoop, and then, directly after they have seized it, make off. Although I recall having told of their customs in my history of the Emperor Marcus, and several times after that, yet I will now briefly relate a few more particulars about them. Among those tribes whose original abode extends from the Assyrians to the cataracts of the Nile and the frontiers of the Belmae, all alike are warriors equal in rank, half nude in dyed cloaks as far as the loins, ranging widely with the help of swift horses and slender camels in times of peace or of disorder. No man ever grasps a plough-handle or cultivates a tree. None seeks a living by tilling the soil, but they rove continually over wide and extensive tracts without a home, without fixed abode, or laws. They cannot long endure the same sky, nor does the sun of a single district ever content them. Their life is always on the move, and they have mercenary wives hired under a temporary contract. But in order that there may be some semblance of matrimony, the future wife, by way of a dowry, offers her husband a spear and a tent, with the right to leave him after a stipulated time, if she so elect. And it is unbelievable with what ardour both sexes give themselves up to passion. Moreover, they wander so widely as long as they live, that a woman marries in one place, gives birth in another, and rears her children far away, without being allowed an opportunity for rest. They all feed upon game and an abundance of milk, which is their main sustenance, on a variety of plants, as well as on such birds as they are able to take by fowling. And I have seen many of them, who were wholly unacquainted with grain or wine. So much for this dangerous tribe. Let us now return to our original theme. The adherents of Magnentius are tortured, AD 354. While this was happening in the east, Constantius was spending the winter at Arles, where on the 10th of October, which marked the end of his 30th year on the throne, he gave shows on a grand scale in the theatre and in the circus. The weight of his arbitrary rule now fell more heavily, and he accepted as clear and established any doubtful or false charge. One example of this was causing Gerontius, an adherent of Magnentius, to be tortured and afterwards to suffer the pains of banishment, as an ailing body is liable to be severely shaken, even by slight indisposition. So Constantius' narrow and sensitive mind treated the slightest rumours as evidence of an actual or projected attempt on his life, and made his victory an occasion of mourning by the slaughter of the innocent. Any military officer or civil dignitary or person of standing among his fellows, who was even faintly suspected of having favoured the opposition, was loaded with chains and dragged away like a wild animal. No pressure from a personal enemy was needed. The fact that he had been named or reported upon or brought to court was enough to ensure that he was condemned to death or deprived of his property or banished to a lonely island. At any hint of encroachment upon his authority, the emperor's harsh and irritable temper, prone in any case to entertain baseless suspicions, was further excited by the flattery of his bloodthirsty courtiers. They magnified every incident and pretended to feel unbounded grief at the dangers threatening the safety of a sovereign on the thread of whose life they hypocritically declared the fate of the whole world hung. So we are told that Constantius, unlike even inexorable emperors in the past, never ordered the sentence of anyone condemned on these or similar charges to be revoked once the warrant had been formally presented. And whereas in other men the taste for slaughter sometimes loses its force as they grow older, in Constantius it became more violent, because the flatterers around him were always rekindling the fire of his stubborn temper. Among these flatterers, the notary Paul was preeminent. He was a native of Spain, with a smooth, inscrutable face, and an extraordinary capacity for scenting hidden perils. He had been sent to Britain to fetch certain officers who had been bold enough to join Magnentius' conspiracy. When he found them unable to resist, he went far beyond his instructions, and, descending like a sudden torrent upon the persons and estates of many people, spread ruin and destruction in various forms. Loading the limbs of freeborn men with chains, and subjecting some to the degradations of handcuffs, he stitched together a patchwork of charges far removed from the truth. This led to a wicked deed which has stamped an indelible mark of shame upon the reign of Constantius. Marcellinus, the pro-prefect who governed these provinces, was deeply grieved at the troubles of the innocent, and made frequent pleas that those who were free of all guilt should be spared. When these proved vain, he threatened to resign, hoping that this at any rate would deter the malicious inquisitor from exposing to evident danger men who were wedded to peace. Paul, believing that this was a clog upon his activity, and being a master in the dreadful art of weaving intrigues, from which he got the nickname of the Chain, involved the governor himself, who was still defending his subordinates in the common peril. He insisted that Marcellinus, together with some tribunes and several others, should be taken under arrest to the imperial court, with the result that Marcellinus, in the face of immediate disaster, assaulted Paul, and, lacking the strength to inflict a fatal wound, thrust the sword that he had drawn into his own side. This was the wretched end to which an upright governor came in his attempt to relieve the miserable plight of many of his people. After these atrocious acts, Paul returned to the emperor's quarters, steeped in blood, and bringing with him a number of prisoners almost crushed with chains, whom he had reduced to squalid misery. On their arrival, the rack was put in order, and the executioners got ready their hooks and instruments of torture. Of these prisoners, many suffered loss of property, others exile, some death. It is difficult to call to mind anyone who was acquitted in Constantius's reign. Once so much as a whisper had set in motion the machinery of punishment. The faults of the Senate and people of Rome. At this time the government of the Eternal City was in the hands of Orphitus, a man whose overbearing behaviour went beyond the proper limits of the office of urban prefect, which he held. He was shrewd and had a thorough knowledge of the law, but he was deficient in the polish which a liberal education normally produces in a man of his rank. During his administration there were serious riots over shortage of wine, which often provoke violent disturbances among a population accustomed to consume it greedily. If any foreigner should happen to read this work, I suppose that he may wonder why, when it has occasion to speak of events at Rome, it should confine itself to riots and taverns and similar sordid subjects. I will give a brief summary of these reasons, which will not, as far as I can help it, depart from the truth. At the time when Rome, a city destined to endure as long as the human race survives, was beginning its ascent to worldwide renown, valour and good fortune, which are so often at variance, conspired in an unbreakable bond to assist the steps by which it rose to glory. If either had failed, Rome would never have reached the heights of greatness. From its first infancy to the end of its childhood, a period comprising some 300 years, the Roman people were engaged in wars close to its walls. Next, in its adolescence, after various grievous struggles, it penetrated beyond the Alps and the sea. In its early and mature manhood, it won laurels of victory in every part of the great globe. Finally, when it was verging on old age, and owed its occasional victories only to its reputation, it gave itself over to a more peaceful way of life. The venerable city, having set its foot on the proud necks of savage peoples, and given them laws to serve as the eternal foundation and guarantee of liberty, took the course which a thrifty, wise and rich parent takes with his children, and handed over to the Caesars the administration of its heritage. Although the tribes and centuries of the voters have long been inactive, and electoral contests have been superseded by a calm which recalls the time of Numa, Rome is accepted in every region of the world as mistress and queen. Everywhere the authority of its senators is paid the respect due to their grey hairs, and the name of the Roman people is an object of reverence and awe. Nevertheless, the majesty of these assemblies is damaged by the disorderly frivolity of a few, who do not bear in mind where they were born, and behave as if they were licensed to indulge in vice and debauchery. As the poet Simonides says, if a man is to live a life of perfect happiness, he need above all a country of which he can be proud. Of these few, some set their hearts upon statues, believing that in this way their fame will be secured forever, as if there were more satisfaction to be gained from senseless bronze figures than from the consciousness of a well-spent life. They have these statues covered in gold leaf, a privilege first granted to Acilius Galabrio for his skill and courage in defeating King Antiochus. But Cato the censor showed how much finer it is to despise these vanities, and to set one's steps on what the bard of Ascura calls the steep path to true glory. When he was asked why, unlike many others, he had no statue, Cato replied, I would rather have good men wondering why I have not deserved a statue than grumbling because I have been given one. That would be much worse. Others think that the height of glory is to be found in unusually high carriages and an ostentatious way of dress. They sweat under the burden of cloaks which they attach to their necks and fasten at the throat. These, being of very fine texture, are easily blown about, and they contrive by frequent movements, especially of the left hand, to show off their long fringes and display the garments beneath, which are embroidered with various animal figures. Others again, with an appearance of deep gravity, hold forth unasked on the immense extent of their family property, multiplying in imagination the annual produce of their fertile lands, which extend, they boastfully declare, from furthest east to furthest west. They presumably do not know that their ancestors, who were responsible for the expansion of Rome, did not owe their distinction to riches, but overcame all obstacles by their valour in fierce wars, in which, as far as wealth or style of living or dress was concerned, they were indistinguishable from common soldiers. This is why a collection had to be made to defray the funeral expenses of the famous Valerius Publicola, why the destitute wife and children of Regalius were maintained by a subscription from her husband's friends, why the daughter of Scipio received a dowry from the state, because the nobles were ashamed that a girl in her bloom should be left to wither in the absence of her indigent father. But nowadays, if you come as a respectable stranger from the provinces to pay a first call on a man who prides himself on his ample means, You will be received like a long-lost friend. You will be asked so many questions that you are driven to invent the answers, and you will be so surprised to find an important personage who has never seen you before paying earnest attention to your slender claims, that you will be sorry that you did not visit Rome 10 years earlier to enjoy such exceptional favour. If relying on this friendly reception you repeat your visit the next day, you will find yourself left standing like an unknown and unwelcomed intruder, while the man who was so encouraging yesterday takes a long time to decide who you are and where you come from. Finally, however, you are recognised, and included in his circle of dependents. But if after that you wait upon him without a break for 3 years and then absent yourself for as many days, you will be back in the same position. He will not ask where you have been, and unless you take yourself off, poor fellow, you will spend your whole life paying vain homage to this booby. Moreover, when at suitable intervals preparations are put in hand for a tedious and unwholesome dinner, or the distribution of the customary client's dole, it is a matter of anxious debate whether, except for those who are owed a return of hospitality, anyone from abroad should be invited, and if, after full consideration, it is decided that they should, the man who is asked will be one who haunts the houses of racing drivers, or is a professor of gambling, or pretends to knowledge of some more recondite mystery. Men of learning and sobriety are shunned as bringers of bad luck, who have nothing to contribute. In addition, the footmen are in the habit of selling invitations of this kind for a fee, and pass off as guests to these charitable distributions and entertainments some people of low origin and obscure station. Not to be tedious, I will pass over the high living which wastes men's substance, and the various temptations in which luxury involves them, and turn to another subject. Some, regardless of the risk, gallop their horses at the speed of the public post through the open spaces and paved streets of the city, hell for leather as the phrase goes. Behind them come their slaves in crowds like a gang of highwaymen, and in the word of the comic poet, not even the jester is left at home. Many ladies copy them, racing through all quarters of the city with covered heads and enclosed litters, and as skilful generals in a pitched battle place in the van their best units in close order, next light-armed troops, behind them javelin men, and finally a reserve ready to reinforce any weak spot. So the stewards of a city household, whose rank is marked by a wand in their right hand, show the same care in discharging their task. As at the word of command, all those employed in weaving march next to the carriage, then comes the smoke-brimaged kitchen staff, after them the rest of the slaves indiscriminately, together with the idle populace of the neighbourhood, finally a crowd of eunuchs, young and old, whose ghastly complexion and distorted features, anyone who sees wherever he goes troops of these maimed creatures must curse the memory of Queen Semiramis of old, who was the first to castrate young males, laying violent hands as it were upon nature, and wresting her from her ordained course, since it is nature who in our infancy implants in us the original source of our seed, and points out by a kind of unwritten law the means by which we are to propagate our race. In this state of things, the few houses which once held the reputation of being centres of serious culture are now given over to the trivial pursuits of passive idleness, and echo with the sounds of singing, accompanied by wind instruments or the twanging of strings. Men put themselves to school to the singer instead of the philosopher, to the theatrical producer rather than the teacher of oratory. The libraries are like tombs, permanently shut. Men manufacture water organs and lutes the size of carriages, and flutes and heavy properties for theatrical performances. Lastly, the ultimate disgrace. Not long ago, when foreigners were banished in headlong haste from the city because a famine was expected, no respite whatsoever was granted to professors of the liberal arts, though very few in number, while at the same time the hangers-on of actors and those who posed as such for the occasion, together with 3,000 dancers and their choruses and the same number of dancing instructors, were allowed to remain within the city without even being questioned. Wherever you turn your eyes, you can see any number of women with curled ringlets, old enough if they were married to be mothers of three, skimming the floor with their feet to the point of exhaustion, and launching themselves into the bird-like evolutions by which they represent the countless scenes which form the imaginary content of theatrical pieces. There can be no doubt that formerly, when every good quality found a dwelling in Rome, many of the grandees tried by various acts of kindness to keep among them strangers of good birth, like the lotus-eaters in Homer who tempted new arrivals with their delicious fruit. Now, however, some are so swollen with empty pride that they despise anyone born outside the city walls. Childless people and bachelors are the only exception. It is hardly credible what attention in various forms is lavished at Rome upon those without children. And since, as you might expect in the capital of the world, the inhabitants are peculiarly subject to severe epidemics of a kind which the whole medical profession is powerless to cure, they have thought of a way of preserving their health. No one visits a friend who is sick, and the more nervous minority adopt a further efficient precaution. When they send a slave to ask how the sufferer is, they do not let him return home until he has taken a bath, so frightened are they of infection at second hand. Yet although they are careful in this respect, some who are crippled, if they are asked to a wedding where there is a prospect of having their palm greased, will find the strength to go as far as Spoleto. Such are the manners of the upper classes. Of the lowest and poorest class, some spend the night in bars, others shelter under the awnings of the theatres, which were first erected by Catullus when he was aedile in imitation of the luxury of Campania. They hold quarrelsome gambling sessions, at which they make ugly noises by breathing loudly through the nose, or else, and this is their prime passion, they wear themselves out from dawn to dusk, wet or fine, in detailed discussion of the merits and demerits of horses and their drivers. It is most extraordinary to see a horde of people hanging in burning excitement on the outcome of a chariot race. Things like this prevent anything worthy of serious mention from happening at Rome, so I must return to my main theme. Outrages and cruel behaviour of Gallus. The Caesar, whose recklessness had now taken a wider scope, which made him hateful to all respectable people, henceforth threw aside all restraint, and made his oppressions felt throughout all the regions of the East, sparing neither officials nor city worthies, nor members of the populace. Finally, maddened by an unwisely blunt answer to a suggestion by him of a sudden and ill-timed price freeze in the face of an impending famine, he issued a single decree for the execution of all of the leading members of the Senate of Antioch, and they would have perished to a man but for the inflexible resistance of Honoratus, at that time Count of the East. Another plain and obvious indication of his cruel nature was the pleasure which he took in gladiatorial shows. He sometimes watched as many as 6 or 7 fights with fascinated attention, and was as happy at the sight of boxers killing one another in bloody combat as if he had made a great financial coup. His propensity for inflicting harm, easily aroused at any time, was further stimulated by a worthless woman, who was admitted to the palace at her own request, and revealed the existence of a secret conspiracy against him by some soldiers of the lowest rank. Constantina, loudly proclaiming her joy that her husband's safety was assured, rewarded the woman, placed her in a carriage, and sent her out by the main gate of the palace so that others might be tempted by her example to lay information about similar or even greater crimes. Soon after, when Gallus was about to set out for Hierapolis in order to give at least the appearance of taking part in a campaign, the people of Antioch humbly besought him to remove the fear of famine, with which a combination of difficulties appeared to threaten them. Unlike other rulers, whose widely extended power often enables them to relieve local distresses, Gallus made no arrangements and gave no orders for the transport of food from neighbouring provinces. Instead, he handed over Theophilus, the governor of Syria, who was standing at his side, to the panic-stricken mob, repeating more than once that no one would lack victuals unless the governor willed it so. This increased the boldness of the rabble, maddened with hunger as the shortage of provisions grew worse. They set fire to the grand house of one Eubulus, who enjoyed a great reputation among his fellows, and treated the governor as a man delivered over to them by imperial decree. They belaboured him with feet and fists till he was half dead, and then finished the wretched man off by tearing him to pieces. After this deplorable murder, everyone saw in the destruction of this one man a model of the danger in which he stood, and feared that this recent example portended a similar fate for himself. At the same time, Cyrenian, a former military commander whose intrepiditude had led, as I have already related, to the sacking of Celsus in Phoenicia, was brought to trial in due form on a charge of treason, and in some mysterious way secured a verdict of acquittal. It was plainly proved that he had caused forbidden spells to be cast upon a cap of liberty which he wore, and had sent his servants with it to inquire of an oracle whether, as he hoped, the imperial power was surely and certainly destined to be his. At the same period, we saw a double misfortune. Theophilus, who was innocent, was the victim of a fearful outrage, and Cyrenian, who deserved universal execration, got off scot-free, though the strength of public opinion almost resulted in a demonstration. Constantius, hearing of these events as they occurred, and having been informed of some particulars by Thalassius, who he learnt had now died a natural death, wrote to the Caesar in mild terms, and little by little deprived him of his backing. He pretended to be alarmed that the military, who are apt to be mutinous when they are unemployed, might form a conspiracy against Gallus' life, and bade him content himself with the detachments of his palace and personal guards, together with the troops known as the Scutari and Gentiles. He also gave instructions to Domitian, who had been promoted from the treasury to the position of praetorian prefect, that on his arrival in Syria he should put gentle and respectful pressure on Gallus to hasten to Italy, to which he had been repeatedly summoned. Domitian proceeded by forced marches on his mission, but when he reached Antioch, instead of visiting the Caesar as he ought, he passed close by the doors of the palace and betook himself in solemn state to his official residence. There he remained for some time, giving his health as a reason for not entering the palace or appearing in public. In fact, he was employing his seclusion in working out a scheme for the Caesar's destruction, and adding superfluous details to the periodic reports which he sent to the emperor. Finally, he was summoned to attend the Caesar's council, where without the slightest preface he began with these rash and ill-considered words. "Obey the emperor's orders and set off, Caesar. I warn you that if you delay, I shall have supplies for you and your court cut off at once." After this insolent speech he went off in a huff, and was never seen in Gallus' presence again, though he was often sent for. The Caesar, resenting this harsh and unworthy treatment, had the prefect arrested by some guards whom he could trust. When he heard of this, Montius, who was then quaestor, a man of excitable disposition but not given to extremes, made a public-spirited attempt to compromise matters. He sent for the leaders of the palace guards, and in a mild speech warned them of the impropriety and mischief of these proceedings, adding, however, in a reproachful tone, that if they were set on this course, they had better begin by overthrowing the statues of Constantius. They would then be in a position to contemplate putting the prefect to death with an easier mind. At this news, Gallus, like a snake wounded by a spear or stone, anticipated the worst, and, grasping at any means of saving himself, assembled all who carried arms, and addressed the astonished throng with snarls and grins of rage as follows: "I need your help, my brave men, in a danger which is threatening us all. Montius, with unprecedented arrogance, has made a speech which amounts to an accusation that I am a rebel in revolt against the majesty of the emperor. He is angered, no doubt, because to teach him a lesson I have ordered the arrest of an insolent prefect who pretends not to know what protocol requires. On the instant, the soldiery, eager as ever for any pretext for violence, attacked Montius, who lived nearby, tied the legs of the frail and ailing old man with rough ropes, and without a moment's delay dragged him off spread eagle to the prefect's residence. In the same fit of fury, they threw Domitian headlong downstairs, tied him up in the same way, and carried their victims bound together in a riotous rush through the wide streets of the city. Finally, when joints and limbs were dislocated, they trampled on their bodies until they were mutilated beyond recognition, and, having glutted their rage, threw them into the river. In the execution of this wicked enterprise, they had been inflamed by madness by the sudden appearance of one Luscus, the city treasurer, who, howling like the leader of a gang of potters, incited them with repeated shouts to finish what they had begun. For this he was not long afterwards burned alive. When Montius was at the last grasp in the hands of his butchers, he called in reproach more than once upon Epignatus and Eusebius, without any indication of their position or rank, so an eager search was made for men with these names, and to keep the pot boiling, the philosopher Epignatus of Cilicia and the ranting speaker Eusebius of Emesa, nicknamed Pitius, were arrested, although the people Montius meant were not these, but 2 tribunes in charge of arsenals, who had promised him arms if there were any sign of a revolution. During these same days, Apollinaris, the son-in-law of Domitian, who until recently had been marshal of the court, and had then been sent by his father-in-law to Mesopotamia, was making strict inquiries among the troops whether they had received any secret messages from Gallus, which gave evidence of some deep-laid design. When he heard what had happened at Antioch, he slipped away through Lesser Armenia and made for Constantinople, from which he was brought back by a detachment of guards and kept under close arrest. In the course of these events, it came to light that a royal robe had been secretly woven at Tyre, though it was not clear who had commissioned it or for whose use it was intended. So the then ruler of the province, who was the father of Apollinaris and bore the same name, was arrested as an accessory, and many others were collected from a number of cities and loaded with accusations of an outrageous kind. And now, when the approach of internecine disaster was being heralded in trumpet tones, the frenzy of Gallus, whose disturbed mind could no longer apprehend the truth, began to emerge from its hitherto latent state. No formal inquiry was made into the reliability of charges imputed or invented, no distinction drawn between innocent and guilty. Justice was exiled, so to speak, from the courts. No voice was raised in defence as prescribed by law. Throughout the eastern provinces, the executioner played his role as the agent of rape, and the death penalty and confiscation were everywhere in evidence. These provinces, I think it now an opportune moment to enumerate, apart from Mesopotamia, which I have already described in my account of the Parthian War, and Egypt, which I must defer to another time. Description of the eastern provinces. After one passes the summits of Mount Taurus, which on the east rise to a lofty height, Cilicia spreads out in widely extended plains, a land abounding in products of every kind, and adjoining its right side is Azuria, equally blessed with fruitful vines and abundant grain, being divided in the middle by the navigable river Chalkidnus. The province, too, in addition to many towns, is adorned by 2 cities, Seleucia, the work of King Seleucus, and Claudiopolis, which Claudius Caesar founded as a colony. For Azuria, which was formerly too powerful, was long ago overthrown as a dangerous rebel, and barely shows a few traces of its former glory. Cilicia, however, which boasts of the river Kidnus, is ennobled by Tarsus, a fair city. This is said to have been founded by Perseus, the son of Jupiter and Dawn, or else by a wealthy and high-born man, Sandan by name, who came from Ethiopia. There is also Anazarbus, bearing the name of its founder, and Mobiusita, the abode of that famous diviner Mobius, he wandering from his fellow warriors the Argonauts, when they were returning after carrying off the Golden Fleece, and being borne to the coast of Africa met a sudden death. Thereafter his heroic remains, covered with Punic sod, have been for the most part effective in healing a variety of diseases. These two provinces, crowded with bands of brigands, were long ago, during the war with the pirates, sent under the yoke by the proconsul Servilius, and made to pay tribute. And these regions indeed, lying as it were upon a promontory, are separated from the eastern continent by Mount Ammianus. But the frontier of the east, extending a long distance in a straight line, reaches from the banks of the Euphrates to the borders of the Nile, being bounded on the left by the Saracen races, and on the right, exposed to the waves of the sea. Of this district, Nicator Seleucus took possession and greatly increased in its power, when by right of succession he was holding the rule of Persia after the death of Alexander of Macedon. He was a successful and efficient king, as his surname Nicator indicates, for by taking advantage of the great number of men whom he ruled for a long time in peace, in place of their rustic dwellings he built cities of great strength and abundant wealth, and many of these, although they are now called by the Greek names which were imposed upon them by the will of their founder, nevertheless have not lost the old appellations in the Assyrian tongue which the original settlers gave to them. And first after Osdrone, which, as has been said, I have omitted from this account, Comagny, now called Euphratensis, gradually lifts itself into eminence. It is famous for the great cities of Hierapolis, the ancient Ninus, and Samosata. Next Syria spreads for a distance over a beautiful plain. This is famed for Antioch, a city known to all the world, and without a rival, so rich is it in imported and domestic commodities. Likewise for Laodicea, Apama, and also Seleucia, most flourishing cities from their very origin. After this comes Phoenicia, lying at the foot of Mount Lebanon, a region full of charm and beauty, adorned with many great cities. Among these in attractiveness and the renown of their names, Tyre, Sidon, and Bertus are conspicuous, and equal to these are Emissa and Damascus, founded in days long past. Now these provinces, encircled by the river Orontes, which, after flowing past the foot of the lofty mountain Cassius, empties into the Parthian Sea, were taken from the realms of the Armenians by Gnaeus Pompey after his defeat of Tigranes, and brought under the Roman sway. The last region of the Syrias is Palestine, extending over a great extent of territory and abounding in cultivated and well-kept lands. It also has some splendid cities, none of which yields to any of the others, but they rival one another, as it were, by plumb line. These are Caesarea, which Herodes built in honour of the Emperor Octavian, Eleutheropolis and Neapolis, along with Ascalon and Gaza, built in a former age. In these districts no navigable river is anywhere to be seen, but in numerous places natural warm springs gush forth, adapted to many medicinal uses. But these regions also met with a like fate, being formed into a province by Pompey after he had defeated the Jews and taken Jerusalem, but left to the jurisdiction of a governor. Adjacent to this region is Arabia, which on one side adjoins the country of the Nabateans, a land producing a rich variety of wares and studded with strong castles and fortresses, which the watchful care of the early inhabitants reared in suitable and readily defendable defiles to check the inroads of neighbouring tribes. This region also has, in addition to some towns, great cities: Bostra, Geraza, and Philadelphia, all strongly defended by mighty walls, it was given the name of a province, assigned a governor, and compelled to obey our laws by the Emperor Trajan, who by frequent victories crushed the arrogance of its inhabitants, when he was waging glorious war with Media and the Parthians. Cyprus, too, an island far removed from the mainland, and abounding in harbours, beside having numerous towns, is made famous by two cities, Salamis and Paphos, the one celebrated for its shrines of Jupiter, the other for its temple of Venus. This Cyprus is so fertile and abounds in products of every kind, that without the need for any help from without, by its native resources alone it builds cargo ships from the very keel to the topmost sails, and equipping them completely entrusts them to the deep. Nor am I loath to say that the Roman people in invading that island showed more greed than justice, for King Ptolemy, our ally, joined to us by treaty without any fault of his, merely because of the low state of our treasury, was ordered to be proscribed, and in consequence committed suicide by drinking poison, whereupon the islands were made tributary, and Cyprus's spoils, as though those of an enemy, were taken aboard our fleet and brought to Rome by Cato. I shall now resume the thread of my narrative. Further history of Gallus. In the midst of these various disasters, Ammianus, to whose staff I had been attached by the Emperor's order, was summoned from Nisibis, where he was in command, and compelled to preside over the investigation of capital charges. This was much against his will, and he protested loudly against the packs of flatterers who yelped around him. He had always shown himself a brave soldier and commander of soldiers, but he was a complete stranger to the strife of the courts, fearing for his own safety when he saw himself associated with venal prosecutors and judges who emerged like wild beasts from the same dens. He kept Constantius informed by private letters of what was happening both in public and behind the scenes, and begged him to send such assistance as would intimidate the Caesar and serve to deflate his notoriously swollen pride. But this excessive caution brought Ammianus into a worse snare, as I shall tell later. His enemies concocted a serious intrigue to poison Constantius' mind, and Constantius, though in general a mild ruler, was cruel and implacable if some nobody brought this sort of thing to his ear, and became in these circumstances quite unlike himself. When the day for these fatal trials arrived, the master of the cavalry took his seat on the bench in the character of a judge, assisted by assessors, who were briefed in advance of the course which things were to take, and surrounded by shorthand writers, who kept the Caesar informed by up-to-date reports of the questions asked and the answers given. The cruel orders of the prince and the influence of the queen, who from time to time thrust out her face from behind a curtain, caused many to perish without being allowed to refute the charges or make any defence. The first persons put on trial, Ammianus and Eusebius, were condemned simply on account of the coincidence of their names. As I have already said, Montius, at the point of death, had incriminated under these names two officials of the arsenal who had promised him assistance in a projected undertaking. Ammianus, who, it became clear, had nothing of the philosopher about him but his dress, first tried supplication, but in vain. Then, when his sides were furrowed by torture and death was before his eyes, he made a shameful confession that he had been a party to a non-existent plot, though he had never heard of nor seen anything and was completely ignorant of public affairs. Eusebius, on the other hand, boldly denied the charges and stood his ground even on the rack, exclaiming loudly that this was a den of thieves, not a court of justice. His knowledge of the law enabled him to press his demand to be faced by his accuser and given a proper trial. But when he heard of this, the Caesar treated his free speech as insolence and ordered him to be put to the question as an impudent slanderer. mangled to such a degree that there was nothing left to torture, begging justice from heaven and smiling defiantly. He remained unshaken and was condemned to death with his wretched companion, without being reduced to accuse either himself or another, without either confessing or being convicted. He was brought to the scaffold, with his spirit unbroken, reviling the wickedness of the times, and following the example of the old Stoic Zeno, who, when he had been tortured for a long time to extort a false confession, tore his tongue from its roots and flung it, bloody spittle and all, in the eyes of the King of Cyprus, who was examining him. Next, the affair of the royal robe was investigated, and after the workers in purple had been tortured and had admitted the making of a short sleeveless tunic, a man named Marus was brought forward, who was what the Christians call a deacon. A letter from him in Greek was produced, addressed to the manager of the factory at Tyre, which pressed for the rapid completion of a piece of work, but gave no indication of its nature. Marus too was tortured almost to death, without any confession being obtained from him. So the scope of the examination was widened to include people of various classes, but certain things remained in doubt, and it was recognised that some charges had been brought without sufficient evidence. Finally, when many had perished, the two Apollinaries, father and son, were condemned to banishment, and when they arrived at an estate which they owned in Carteri, about 24 miles from Antioch, their legs were broken, according to orders, and they were put to death. Their execution did nothing to abate the ferocity of Gallus. On the contrary, like a lion who has tasted human flesh, he went on to hunt out other prey of the same kind. These cases, however, I shall not relate individually, for fear of exceeding the limits which I have set myself, an error which must certainly be avoided. Constantius grants peace to the Alemanni. While the East was enduring these prolonged misfortunes, Constantius, in his own 7th and the Caesar's 3rd consulship, moved at the beginning of the warm season from Arles to Valentia, intending to take the field against the brothers Gunomad and Vadomar, kings of the Alemanni, whose frequent raids were devastating the frontier regions of Gaul. He was kept there some time, waiting for supplies from Aquitaine, the arrival of which was delayed by unusually heavy spring rains and swollen rivers. During this interval, a staff officer called Herculanus reached the court. He was the son of the former master of cavalry, Hermognes, who, as I have already told, was torn to pieces by the mob in a riot at Constantinople. He brought an accurate account of the behaviour of Gallus and his wife, but Constantius, though full of grief for the past and fear for the future, kept his disquiet at bay as long as he could. Meanwhile the troops, who were all assembled at Cabellona, chafed at the delay, all the more because they were on short commons, their usual supplies not having yet arrived. They brought Rufinus, at that time Praetorian Prefect, into great danger. To pacify the army and to explain the reasons why its supplies were held up, he was obliged to go in person to visit the troops, whose surliness was increased by shortage of food, and who in any case are traditionally rough and brutal in their behaviour to civil functionaries. This was a clever and deliberate plot to bring about the death of Gallus's uncle, whose power was such that it was thought that it might encourage his nephew in his fatal ambitions, but Rufinus discharged his task with such loyalty that this design was deferred, and the Grand Chamberlain Eusebius was sent to Cabellona with money, which he distributed secretly among the authors of the agitation. This quieted the unrest of the troops and saved the life of the prefect. Shortly afterwards supplies arrived in abundance, and the army moved from its camp on the appointed day. After a difficult march over roads which were mostly blocked by snow, the army reached Rarace, on the banks of the Rhine, but the superior force of the Alemanni host, which let loose upon them a hail of missiles, prevented them from building a bridge of boats. The apparent impossibility of crossing took the emperor by surprise, and he was anxiously debating his next step, when unexpectedly a guide presented himself who knew the country, and in return for a reward pointed out by night a ford where the river was passable. While the enemy's attention was concentrated on another place, our army might have crossed at this point before anyone was aware, and gone on to ravage the whole region, had not a few men of the same race, who had attained high rank in our army, sent a secret warning to their compatriots. That at any rate was what some believed, and suspicion fell on Latinus, count of the household troops, Agillo, the superintendent of the stables, and Scudillo, the general of the Scutari, all men who were held in high respect as pillars of the state. The barbarians, however, took the decision which the circumstances required, either because the auspices happened to be unfavourable or because they were forbidden to join battle on religious grounds. They relaxed the unbending spirit which stiffened their resistance and sent some of their chief men to beg pardon for their wrongdoing and ask for peace. The envoys of the kings were detained and the matter privately debated for some time. Finally, when it was generally agreed that it would be advantageous to grant peace on the reasonable conditions proposed, the emperor decided to address his assembled troops on the situation, taking his place on the platform used for such occasions and surrounded by a retinue of high officials. He spoke to the following effect: "None of you, I hope, will feel surprised if, after undergoing the toil of so long a march and accumulating supplies in such abundance, at a moment when my confidence in you has brought me to the verge of barbarian territory, I seem suddenly to change my plans and adopt a more peaceful course. If each of you will take thorough accounting of his rank and capacity, he will find it to be true that, whereas any individual soldier, however strong and vigorous his fame, concentrates solely on the preservation of himself and his own life, a conscientious commander who must consult the interests of all equally is aware that the safety of those for whom he is responsible cannot be separated from his own. He should therefore seize eagerly as heaven sent favours any opportunities of relief that the circumstances admit. So I will show you in a word, my trusty comrades, why I have assembled you all here, and ask you to lend a favourable ear to my brief explanation. It is always a simple matter to set forth the truth. The kings and people of the Alemanni, seeing with fear the height of glory you have attained, which report has spread in glowing terms to the inhabitants of the most distant quarters, have sent their spokesman to ask with bowed heads for forgiveness of their past offences and for peace. This request I have considered with all due caution and deliberation, and with an eye to our advantage, and I believe that there are many reasons why, if I have your approval, it should be granted. First, it will enable us to avoid the chances and changes of war. Second, we have the promise of their help instead of their enmity. Next, we shall secure without bloodshed the abatement of those fits of ferocity which have often proved destructive to our provinces. Finally, we must reflect that there are more ways than one of beating an enemy. He can either fall in battle overcome by the weight of arms, or he can take the safer course of submitting voluntarily to the yoke before the trumpets sound. Discovering by experience that the victors are lacking neither in courage against the defiant nor in mercy to the submissive. In short, you are the judges and I await your decision, believing myself as a peace-loving prince that it is best to behave with restraint when luck has come our way. I am sure that such a wise decision will not be ascribed to lack of spirit on our part, but to moderation and humanity. No sooner had he ended than the whole army fell in with his wishes, praising his judgment, and gave their voice for peace. What specially moved them was the knowledge acquired in several campaigns that it was only in civil strife that the Emperor's guardian angel kept a watchful eye on him, and that his foreign wars had generally ended in disaster, so a treaty was made according to the forms observed by the Alemanni, and when this had been done, the emperor departed to spend the winter at Milan. The Caesar Gallus is sent for by Constantius and executed. Here, free from the weight of other cares, Constantius addressed his mind to the knotty problem posed by the Caesar, an obstacle in his path which it would need all his strength to remove. In many discussions held secretly at night with his nearest associates, he debated how this might be achieved by force or fraud before Gallus' increasing confidence caused him to embark on a more persistent course of disruption. Finally, it was decided to send him a mild letter summoning him to Milan on the grounds that he was needed for a very urgent public business. In this way he could be deprived of support and put to death without let or hindrance. This plan was opposed by several groups of fickle courtiers, among whom was Arbito, an ardent intriguer, and Eusebius, the Grand Chamberlain, who was even more given to mischief. They objected that it would be dangerous to leave Ursicinus in the east after the Caesar's departure, with no one to check any ambitious design that he might entertain. They were supported by the rest of the eunuchs in the royal service, whose greed at that time passed all human bounds, and who found in the course of their private attendance on the emperor opportunities for fostering fictitious accusations by mysterious whisperers. The gallant officer was almost crushed by the implacable hatred of his enemies. They put about a rumour that his grown sons, who were popular on account of their looks and youth, were being groomed for supreme power, and that their reputation for versatility in the management of arms and for physical agility in the daily military exercises was part of this plan. It was suggested that Gallus' naturally savage temper had been excited to acts of violence by agents placed about him for this purpose, so that when he had earned the detestation of all classes, the trappings of imperial power might be transferred to the sons of the Master of Horse. While this and similar talk assailed the harassed emperor's ears, which were always open to gossip of this kind, he wavered between various courses, but concluded in the end that the best plan open to him was to begin by sending for Ursicinus in the most honorific terms, alleging that in the present crisis he urgently needed to consult him about the additional forces required to break the threatened attack of the Parthian peoples. To avert any suspicion on the part of Ursicinus, Count Prosper was sent to act as his deputy until he returned. So when this letter arrived together with leave to use the imperial posting system, he hurried to Milan with all possible speed. The next thing was to induce the Caesar to hasten his own departure, and to remove any suspicion, Constantius urged his sister, Gallus's wife, to come to him, pretending with many professions of affection that he had long desired a visit from her. Though she feared his cruel nature and hesitated, she set out in the hope that as he was her brother, she would be able to soften him. But when she reached the post station in Bithynia, called Sine Galacini, she was carried off by a sudden fever. Her death left her husband a prey to anxiety about his best course. He realised that he had lost his chief supporter, and in his difficult and confused situation, one thought alone occupied his distracted mind, that Constantius, who relied entirely upon his own judgment, would admit no excuse and grant no forgiveness for his errors, but being inclined, as he was, to destroy his kindred, would spread a secret snare for him, and punish him with death if he caught him off his guard. In these straits, expecting the worst if he relaxed his vigilance, he came to a secret decision to lay claim to supreme power if he saw an opening. He had, however, a double reason for fearing that he would be betrayed by those nearest to him. First, because they dreaded his cruel and capricious temper, and second, because they were overawed by the better luck of Constantius in civil warfare. In the midst of these great and crushing anxieties, he received incessant letters from the emperor, advising and entreating his presence, and obliquely hinting that the empire neither could nor should be divided, but that everyone must contribute what he could to its support in its present tottering state, an allusion presumably to the devastation of the Gallic provinces. By way of precedent from the not very distant past, Constantius added that Diocletian and his colleague had employed the Caesars as adjutants, who were dispatched hither and thither about the empire and had no fixed place of residence, and that on one occasion in Syria, when the Augustus was angry, Galerius in his purple had marched on foot in front of his carriage for nearly a mile. Last in a number of envoys came Scudilo, tribune of the Scutari, who under a blunt exterior concealed consummate skill in the art of persuasion. By a mixture of flattery and lies he succeeded where all others had failed in enticing Gallus to set out, constantly assuring him with an appearance of sincerity that his cousin was burning with eagerness to see him, that his gentleness and mildness were such that he would pardon anything he had done amiss, and that he would associate him with himself in the empire and make him his partner in the tasks which had been undertaken in the long-exhausted provinces of the north. It is commonplace that when fate lays its hands upon a man, his perceptions are dulled and blunted. Gallus was encouraged by these blandishments to hope for better things, and leaving Antioch under an evil star, jumped, as the old proverb puts it, from the frying pan into the fire. On reaching Constantinople, he held games in the hippodrome, as if he were perfectly safe and secure, and placed the crown on the head of the charioteer Thorax, who was the winner. At this news, Constantius' rage passed all bounds. To prevent Gallus in his anxiety for his future from attempting to secure his safety by stirring up revolutionary movements along his route, he deliberately removed from their posts all the troops stationed in the towns which the Caesar had to pass through. At that moment, Taurus, who was travelling to Armenia to take up the post of Quaestor, passed through Constantinople without troubling to address Gallus or visit him, but other persons arrived by the emperor's orders, ostensibly to take up various posts, but in reality to keep Gallus under observation and prevent him making any move. Among them was Leontius, afterwards urban prefect, who came as quaestor, Lucilian, appointed count of the bodyguard, and a tribune of the Scutari called Binobordes. After a long march over level ground, Gallus reached Adrianople, a city in the neighbourhood of Mount Haemus, previously called Uscadama. There he stopped to rest for 12 days, and learned that the Theban legions, who were wintering in towns nearby, had sent some of their number with strong assurances of loyalty to advise him to remain where he was. Stationed as they were in large numbers in the locality, they were confident of their own strength, but the constant vigilance of those around him prevented Gallus from snatching any opportunity of seeing them or hearing their errand. Since letter after letter arrived urging his departure, he made use of 10 vehicles of the imperial post, in accordance with the emperor's instructions, and, leaving behind all his retinue except a few whom he had brought to wait on him in his bedroom and at table, he yielded to pressure and hastened his journey, covered with dust and frequently reproaching himself with tears and curses for his own rashness, which had brought him down and placed him at the mercy of the lowest of the low. At this time, whenever nature granted him the respite of sleep, his senses were assailed by the shrieks of terrifying spectres, and hosts of his victims, headed by Domitian and Montius, seemed in his dream to be seizing him and delivering him into the clutches of the Furies. When the soul is set free from its ties with the body, it remains ceaselessly active and summons up from the subconscious thoughts and anxieties which harass men's minds, visions of the night, which we Greeks call phantoms. So, as his miserable lot opened before him, the path on which he was fated to lose both his power and his life, he proceeded without a stop and with many relays of horses to Potovio, a town in Noricum. Here the whole truth of the plot against him was at last revealed. Count Barbatio, who had commanded his bodyguard, suddenly appeared together with the secret agent Apodemius. He brought with him picked troops who were bound to the emperor by past favours, and whose loyalty he was confident would be proof against either bribery or pity. Henceforward all pretence was laid aside. Barbato, after surrounding with armed men all that part of the palace which lay outside the walls, entered as night was falling, stripped the Caesar of his royal apparel, and dressed him in the tunic and cloak of a common soldier, assuring him, however, with repeated oaths, that he had the emperor's authority to tell him he would suffer nothing further. Then, with the order, "Stand up at once," he set him before he knew what was happening in a private carriage, and conveyed him to a place in Istria, near the town of Pola, where I am told that Crispus, the son of Constantine, was formerly put to death. There he was kept in close confinement, half dead with fear of his approaching fate, till he was visited by Eusebius, at that time Grand Chamberlain, Pentardius, a notary, and Malobordes, a tribune of the guards. They had orders from the emperor to question him in detail on the reasons which had led him to order the death of each of his victims at Antioch. Gallus, with a face as white as that of Adrastartus, had just strength enough to reply that most of them had been massacred at the insistence of his wife Constantina. He was ignorant, no doubt, of the wise answer given by Alexander the Great to his mother when she was urging him to put to death an innocent person, and in the hope of getting what she wanted reminded him that she had carried him for 9 months in her womb. "Ask some other boon, my good mother. No benefit can be put in the balance with the life of a good man." When this was reported to the emperor, his anger and indignation became inexorable. He saw that his only means of ensuring his own safety lay in the destruction of Gallus, so he sent Serenian, who, as I have already said, had escaped a charge of treason by a sort of sleight of hand, together with Pentadius, the notary, and Apodemius, the security agent, with orders to carry out the execution, and Gallus, with his hands tied like a highwayman, was beheaded. His head and face were mutilated, and the man who so short a time before had been an object of dread to cities and provinces was lying a hideous corpse upon the ground. But the justices of the powers above keep their unsleeping eyes on both sides alike. Gallus was brought down by his own wicked deeds, but guilty though he was, both the men who had led him into a fatal snare by their lies and cajolery were cut off not long after by an agonizing death. Scudilio was attacked by an abscess of the liver and died vomiting up his lungs. Barbito, who had over a long period been inventing false charges against Gallus, fell victim to a whispering campaign. The suggestion that he had higher ambitions than the supreme command of the infantry led to his condemnation, so by an unlamented death he made reparation to the spirit of the Caesar, whom his treachery had destroyed. These and countless other events of this kind are brought to pass from time to time, would that it be invariably so, by the operation of Nemesis, who punishes evil and rewards good deeds. She is the sublime manifestation of a powerful divinity dwelling, men believe, above the orbit of the moon. Others define her as the personification of a protective power, exercising a general surveillance over the destinies of individuals, and represented in the Theogonies of old as the daughter of justice, who, from her unseen eternal throne, looks down upon all things on earth, Queen over all causation and arbiter and umpire of all events, she controls the urn from which men's lots are cast, and regulates their vicissitudes of fortune, often bringing their enterprises to a different end from that which they designed, and confounding their various actions by the changes which she imposes. It is she, too, who binds the vainly swelling pride of mortal men in the indissoluble chain of necessity, and casts, as she alone can, her weight into the scale by which they rise or fall. At one moment she bears down upon the stiff necks of the proud, and takes away their strength. At another she raises the good out of the dust, and exalts them to prosperity. The myths of antiquity endowed her with wings, so that all might understand that she appears with the speed of a bird. They put a rudder in her hand, and a wheel beneath her feet, to signify that she runs through all the elements and governs the universe. Such was the way in which Gallus, who had himself become weary of life, come to an untimely end, at the age of 28, after a reign of 4 years. He was born in Etruria at Maesa Virchinensis. His father was Constantius, the brother of the Emperor Constantine, and his mother Galla, the sister of Rufinus and Cerelis, who both attained the distinction of the consulship and a prefecture. He was a man of remarkably good looks, with a fine frame and well-proportioned limbs. His hair was blond and soft, and his beard, though at first a delicate down, gave him a look of authority beyond his years. In character, the difference between him and his sober brother Julian was as great as between Domitian and Titus, the sons of Vespasian. After reaching the highest place that fortune can give, he experienced the caprice by which she makes a mockery of human life, at one moment exalting men to the sky, and at the next plunging them into the depths of hell. Of this there are innumerable examples, some of which I will briefly touch upon. The same fickle and changeable fortune raised Agathocles from the trade of a potter to be king of Sicily, and set Dionysus, once the terror of nations, to preside over an elementary school at Corinth. She brought Adriscus of Adramyttium, a man born in a fuller's shop, to a position in which he could assert the name of Philip, and taught the legitimate son of Perseus to earn his living by the trade of a blacksmith. She delivered Mancinus, after he had held supreme command, into the hands of the people of Numantia, and she abandoned Veturius and Claudius to the tender mercies of the Samnites and Corsicans respectively, and she subjected Regulus to the cruelty of the Carthaginians. Through the injustice of fortune, Pompey, whose glorious exploits had earned him the title of the Great, was murdered in Egypt at the behest of eunuchs, while a convict called Eunice achieved the command of fugitive slaves in Sicily. How many Romans of high birth prostrated themselves at the feet of Virathus or Spartacus, while this mistress of the world looked on? How many heads, at which the peoples of the earth trembled, have fallen by the fatal hand of the executioner? One man is thrown into prison, another is raised to power beyond his hopes, a third is cast down from the highest pinnacle of greatness. To try to fathom the variety and frequency of such events would be as foolish as to try to number the sands of the sea, or to calculate the weight of mountains.